Hey everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss, and it's a beautiful fall Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today we are in downtown Harrisburg to talk about mulberry trees. Why mulberry trees? Well, because a fascinating book came into Midtown Scholar this past week about mulberry trees, and it got me thinking about how Harrisburg's own history is entwined with that of a very famous mulberry tree. Because it was here at this spot, supposedly in 1733, that the founder of Harrisburg, John Harris, was tied to a mulberry tree. Now, he operated a ferry that went back and forth across the Susquehanna River. And if you look over there, would have been about where that railroad bridge is now. And his son, John Harris Jr., built the house behind us there, which is the John Harris Mansion. But back in 1733, 1733, he was approached by Native Americans who didn't like what he was doing, supposedly tied him to this mulberry tree and were about to burn him alive when he was saved at the last minute. Now, this story is entirely fictional. And we know it's entirely fictional because it wasn't told till 100 years later, in the 1820s and the 1830s, at a time in American history where we were having what was called the mulberry craze. And yes, there was a mulberry craze in American history where everybody who was anybody wanted to plant and import mulberry trees. And this particular genus of mulberry tree didn't even exist in Pennsylvania back in 1733. So let's get right to our book. And before we do that, though, I will show you some pictures. This story was so popular in Harrisburg's history that during the Victorian period, there were stereoview cards all made of the stump of the mulberry tree to which John Harris was supposedly tied. There's somebody at the gates of these very gates looking at the tree. These cards date from the 1860s and 1870s. There's the mansion in the background. There's the stump, and there's a sign on the stump. By the way, Amanda, we sell stereoviews like these in the new George's Collectible Room, starting as low as $3. Original photos from the Victorian period. So check out our new collectibles room, now open Fridays and Saturdays, 10 to 6. All right, on to the mulberry craze. So in the 1820s, a number of people got the great idea that they were going to import mulberry trees to the United States, and this was going to be the next great thing that was going to earn them all sorts of money. Why mulberry trees? Because mulberry trees were the favorite of the silkworm. And the silkworm would eat on the leaves and use those leaves to produce more and more silk. Here's an actual mulberry tree leaf. Here's some nice hand-colored lithographs from the book, and this is about the mulberry tree craze. Here in the back of the book, you can see the silkworm, which used to feed on the mulberry trees. And this is a book from Massachusetts, and it talks about the benefits of mulberry trees. And mulberry trees were supposed to cultivate industriousness in those who cultivated them. They were seen as a tree that was a moral tree that was going to make farmers able to compete with capitalists. And therefore, the symbolism of having John Harris associated with a mulberry tree was a symbolism of saying that he was essentially a moral person, very similar to the story of, say, George Washington and his cherry tree. Well, we have John Harris and his mulberry tree. In Massachusetts, it's doubly interesting because about the time of this book and this speech, mulberry trees get intertwined with the anti-slavery movement, and you have a number of utopian communities that are founded near Northampton, Massachusetts, to create mulberry trees and also mulberry orchards, and also become stops along the Underground Railroad. And a very famous former enslaved person, Sojourner Truth, rose to prominence working on one of these communes in Northampton, Massachusetts, raising mulberry trees and fighting against slavery. Once mulberry trees get associated with the anti-slavery movement, the story in Harrisburg changes again. And for the first time in the 1840s and 1850s, John Harris is actually supposedly now in the story saved by his slave, a slave by the name of Hercules, who comes to his rescue and who he then emancipates on the spot. Again, all fiction, not true, but interesting and tied very much to American history. What happens with mulberry trees, Amanda, is that we have the first great sort of speculative bubble that occurs in American history. Everybody buys mulberry trees. They go from being priced at about $3 for 100 mulberry trees to $3 a tree. The whole market collapses, and people go bankrupt, and the whole mulberry craze is sort of done by the 1840s. You can still grow mulberry trees and produce silk today, but it was a particular moment in time in America. And also at that time, street after street throughout the United States was named Mulberry Street, including a street in Springfield, Massachusetts, not far from Northampton, where a young Theodore Geisel was living. And if you don't know who Theodore Geisel is, he grows to prominence as Dr. Seuss. And Dr. Seuss has a special place in my heart because when I was in 5th grade, I wrote a report on the Lorax and environmentalism, and I sent it to Theodore Geisel, and he wrote me back a letter with a little hand-drawn cat in the hat saying that he really enjoyed my story. So imagine how surprised I was this past week when we received an email notice urgently from eBay saying, "Hello, Midtown Scholar Bookstore. We have had to remove your listing because it didn't follow our offensive material policy. Listings that promote or glorify hatred, violence, or discrimination aren't allowed. This book has been removed and cannot be sold on eBay." And I went, well, what book could that be? We certainly don't want to have books like that for sale. And believe it or not, the most offensive book in the history of the Midtown Scholar was indeed Seuss by Seuss. Because Seuss by Seuss, along with The Grinch, contains Dr. Seuss's first story, which is To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, written about his hometown in Springfield. And just to show you one interesting aspect of the book, later in life, Dr. Seuss did realize that ethnic stereotypes were harmful, and he edited his story so that he took this image here and he removed the yellow coloring, and he removed some of the caricatures of the design, and he basically apologized. And even though he apologized and edited the story, this book is still banned today, even the revised version by Dr. Seuss. Also interesting about Mulberry Street was it was his first children's book, and at the time children's books had to convey a moral story to the reader, and he had trouble getting it published because it was about this boy that basically imagined all these things that he saw on Mulberry Street. So he only got it published when at the end the boy tells his father, when his father asks, "What'd you see on Mulberry Street?" He says, "Well, I didn't see anything on Mulberry Street," and he tells the truth, and he says he made it all up, which is an interesting story. All right, we're going to end today with a funny book, a book that we found in our very own tent sale, and a book that relates to Dr. Seuss, because did you know, Amanda, that Dr. Seuss wrote perhaps the best-selling adult paperback of World War II, a book that was published in 1.3 million copies and sent to the fronts in both Germany and Japan from 1941 to 1945. And it was a book, a funny book, that was called The Pocketbook of Boners. And by boners, they mean silly sayings that in this case, children came up with. And Dr. Seuss illustrated these silly sayings in a book called The Pocketbook of Boners. 1.3 million copies of this book were sold. And in this book, you may not know this, but you see the origins of Dr. Seuss's initial drawings of cats. And these are some of the illustrations that I find quite amusing. Not much like the Cat in the Hat, but here's one illustrating Benjamin Franklin produced electricity by rubbing cats backwards. Look at those cats. Or another one in which Dr. Seuss is illustrating It's Raining Cats and Dogs. You can see that distinctive style. It makes you laugh today. It shows you the sort of amazing things that Dr. Seuss did before he started writing his better-known children's books after World War II. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed another edition of Buy Day. We'll be back next Friday and every Friday with more fascinating books from the world of books in Harrisburg.